Well, we're talking to Linda Swindell from Maguire's Bridge, but who has family in Fermanagh, especially, I think Linda brought up around Lisnaskea and lots of memories around there as well. So, Linda, tell us a bit about your family.
Well, I was brought up just outside Brickborough, but my parents were both brought up in the Lisnaskea area. My father just outside it. My dad lived in different places just outside Lisnaskea and then later in Castle Balfour. And Mum lived a bit further out of Lisnaskea, but Lisnaskea would have been their main town that they would have went to for whatever they needed. So my father's family, I have researched, and they go back to like the 1700s in the Lisnaskea area, so we're sort of grounded in there now for quite a while. But I suppose my mother's family would have lived, I think the townland is Doon and Eastcliffe, so it's quite difficult to say, but it's nearer Rosslea than Lisnaskea. But that's a way further back, and then they moved to Carrickaheenan, so that's a bit up in the mountain. We call it mountain, but it's not quite, it's just hilly ground, you know, above Lisnaskea. So they would have lived there till around the time we're talking about here, 1912 and up into the late 1920s.
Just before you go on and talk about your Uncle William and so on, can I just check, you see that microphone, can you just make sure the microphone, it's sticking up so it's not being disturbed by your collar. Just need to stop you're talking now.
Is that it?
I think that's it, yeah.
Okay.
So we're talking about the period 1912 to 23. So you had an uncle in the war, did you?
Yes, I had, well, not an uncle, being great uncles of mine. Had been my mum's uncles. Mm-hmm. So Mum would have been Morrow, and she used to talk of an Uncle William. I've never been quite able to tie down if it's Uncle William or Great Uncle William, because she used to talk about old Granny Morrow. So I don't know if there was a Granny Morrow and an old Granny Morrow, but he was an Uncle William, and she said he went to war. And one day a telegram, she'd been told this story, one day a telegram came to say he was missing in action and presumed dead. But the old lady just never would accept that he had died, and she said always, you know, one day, mark my words, she said one day he's going to walk through that door. And she didn't die till I think it was the late 1930s, and even then she was still expecting him to walk in the door. She just never ever could accept that he had died in the war. And I think because there was no body, nothing, you know, to physically say, yes, he's definitely dead. So she never did accept. And that seemed to be, it obviously affected her for the rest of her life, you know.
Did anybody ever talk to her about it from the army, or did she just get a telegram and that was it and nothing else?
That was my mother, and she's told me that bit, you know, many times, that they got the telegram missing in action. And she's never said if they got anyone else to tell them anything. I don't know. Mm-hmm. That.
But there was no body, and she just expected him. Maybe hope more than expectation.
Yeah, I would say so.
To walk through the door.
Yeah.
That's dreadful, isn't it?
She just couldn't believe it, couldn't accept it, just.
It's hard to imagine these days. Families would have to go through something like
that. It is, it's terrible.
What age was it?
She did, I think she thought he's knocked on the head, and he's, I don't know what age he would have been. I presume he'd been like 20s or thereabouts, but I don't know that for definite.
And you never found a body?
No, never found. And I don't even know if my mum has passed on where he was when it happened, because I don't know. I've always had it in my head that it's France, but I can't, when I've been trying to remember, I can't remember being actually told that. So I really don't know where he was, even when it happened.
Was his name Swindell, or?
No, that was Morrow.
Okay, sorry, you said that.
He was Morrow, yeah. Most of my stories are from my mum's side. She would have talked more about the past, and my dad wouldn't have talked so much. Bits and pieces, but not a lot. He didn't almost seemed like he didn't want to remember, you know.
Was that just typical man, or was that for reasons?
He was a very quiet man, so I would say it was probably him being just typically my dad, a big quiet man. Yeah, it probably was that. I'm not sure where to go next.
So this was William Morrow's mother.
Yes.
Who wouldn't accept that he had died, and your mother then wasn't born until 1925.
That's right.
But who was the old granny then? And
well, I
tell
know
us about her.
this is later on, but I know my mother's father died when she was only 7. He was killed off a motorbike just at Lisnaskea, and another motorbike hit him. But as I say, that was 1932. So she was only young, and Granny brought the family up with 7 children and a brother-in-law's child. The mother had died tragically. So there was 8 kids she reared. But that's my mum's recollections were that there was 2 old grannies lived with them, and one was old granny and the other was a granny. So there was obviously 2 generations. That my granny, who was a widow by then, she had taken in these 2 old. So it seemed to be the thing. You bring maybe I presume they were widows as well, because there didn't seem to be anyone else. They didn't talk about another man in the house. It was just these 2 old ladies. So they must have took them in and helped, look after them until she died.
So, but in those at those times, I suppose, especially that 1912 to 1923 time, it's probably just about communities helping each other and families helping each other.
Yeah, I think it was families. They did seem to do that. Once somebody needed help, you just moved in. We have a spare room. We'll look after you. It seemed to be quite common then, whereas now it's not so much.
And it's maybe partly because there weren't things like residential homes and
yeah,
things
well,
like
that's
that
right. There was no welfare system or anything at that time, so that's quite possibly why. Yeah, and then the other alternative is the workhouse, so they won't have wanted to go there. And she did have 2 farms of land, so possibly, maybe she had the means to do it. Small farms, but it was probably a big thing in those days.
What effect do you think that would have had on your mother as a child growing up, to have, a granny and an old granny, as she would have called it, in the house?
I think she probably just took it for granted, because that's how it was. They were out in the country. Yeah, I don't think she thought it was abnormal in any way. She didn't. She actually talked fondly of growing up. She seemed to be quite happy. And the kids were all quite close together. So, yeah, I think she was happy.
I'm sure she was. I think it's great, actually.
Yeah.
Your parents would have talked to you a lot about families that move north. Tell us, what do you mean by that, and tell us what they talked about.
They would have talked about a lot of farmers moving north, or sometimes just moving from the like of Rosslea, or near where they lived. For a time, my grandparents would have lived sort of between Rosslea and Lisnaskea, and they would have talked about people moving away from where they lived, either the other side of the border and the northern, which became Northern Ireland, the northern side of the border, moving away, whether it was through fear or intimidation. I'm not quite sure. I would say I've read a bit about what has happened at that time, and I would say that it probably was fear in most cases. But I do know that a great uncle of mine would be my father's uncle, Armstrong Swindell. They lived at Scottstown, and he worked for some big house estate, and I think it was a gatehouse they lived in. It was just a little gatehouse, and I think they had 2 kids by that time, and their home was burnt out. The gatehouse was burnt out, so they had to move away. I think they moved to Mullafad, like forestry cottages, but they moved away from the border, more into the county. And they never ever went back up to live that way. So
was this about the time?
And that was the time around partition, yeah. I think just before. Whether it was the time the boundary was being discussed or whether it was just later, but it's around that time. So you're in the 1920s, around that.
Okay. And they would have been folk who would have associated themselves as unionists, or
Yeah, they would have considered themselves unionist, yes.
and so the border was on the wrong side for them, I suppose.
Yeah, I think that's probably what it was, but the fact that the house, for them in particular, the house being burnt, was probably they just wanted to move away, to somewhere they felt safer.
And what happened that the house was burnt down? Do you know the detail of that?
My understanding was it was like sectarian. They didn't want them there and they wanted them moved out.
Okay. And did they come home to find it burning, do you know, or was it when they were in the house, or?
I'm trying to remember that. I did talk to the daughter of one of them, but she didn't remember very much either. She would only been a small child. She's dead now, of course, but I don't know if she remembered very much, really. Just that they were moved very quickly.
And maybe they wouldn't want to talk about it much afterwards.
Yeah, I think that's a lot of it, because a lot of those things are talked sort of in hushed tones, and especially if you're a child, you're chased, or you're not. They don't want to tell you anything. But that was my understanding, was that they felt intimidated and in fear of being where they were, so they moved away.
Okay. And did they have family? Did they have children when they moved?
I think they had 2 small children.
Okay.
They weren't very long married. They had 2 small children.
It's a very traumatic thing to happen to a family, isn't it? How do you think they felt about that?
I would imagine they may have been bitter, that they were ousted from their home and from where they'd hoped to make their home. But they did move, and they lived in the local area here to where I am, Maguire's Bridge, later on in life. But they moved first to Mullaghfad, to the forestry cottages. I don't know whether that was to do with, why sometimes the states found them work. I don't know if that was how he got that work, but that's where they went to after that. But yeah, I would say there was a lot of fear, and maybe that fear dragged on for quite a long time.
Do you know, would they have crossed the border again in visits or for work to go down south, or would they not have done that, do you know?
I don't remember hearing of them going down south again, no. I don't think so. I didn't, my dad's Uncle Armstrong was dead when I was little, so I don't really remember him at all. I know my dad was close to him, but I don't remember whether they would even went to the likes of Bundoran, on a day trip or something like that later in life, but I don't ever recall. I think they just weren't people to travel, they liked home.
But I'm wondering, did it affect their attitude to the south, or to whether they wanted to travel back or not? Because I wouldn't be surprised if they didn't want to. It's just, if that sort of thing happened to you.
I really don't know for definite.
That's okay. Tell us about your granddad. Is it your granddad Ned?
Yes. What was? Oh, they were in the USC.
If that's what you want to talk about.
Yeah, he had married my grandmother. They were married in 1914. She had been in Scotland for a while. They went for work and then came back, and she must have met my dad, and they got married, and they'd started up home at Carrigahenan. And I don't know when exactly they joined the USC, but they joined that. I have a photograph that shows that he doesn't have proper uniform, or what I consider proper uniform. He just seems to have like a bandolier with ammo in it and a cap with the badge. I think it looks like a harp and crown. The photograph's not great, but it's just like ordinary clothes underneath that. It's so I've been told that that's a very early photograph.
I thought maybe it was 1921 or 1922.
I think it must have been around then, so it must have been very early. So that my mother's cousin, who's still alive, she had told me stories of her, because she was brought up in a family who the father told a lot. too, you know, where she was just an only child, so she was told everything. And he had said about they'd been with my dad, and her dad had been out in the US in what she called the B-men at the border near, I think she said near Rosslea, and they were lying in the hedge. I take it it's like a patrol business, and two of their colleagues, they were attacked, like ambushed, and two of their colleagues, I think she said they were killed at the time, but I can't remember names even. I just know that that's who they were. He was Johnson Bernie, and my dad was Ned Morrow again. So that would have been quite frightening, and I know that that sort of attitude probably stayed with most unionists. You know, they were quite in fear. I'm saying unionists because that was my background brought up, because you're brought up, you know, I was brought up as a Protestant, and that's your fear, whereas I understand, you know, that everybody has that fear because it's inbuilt in your background, you know. One fears something else that's different, and you know, how much of it was real fear and how much of it was imagined is what I'm trying to say. I don't know. But I don't remember them. They always got on with neighbours and things like that, so I don't remember that being an issue. But I do, she would have talked like things like that. They were fearful of their neighbours, but at the same time the neighbours would have helped out and things like that. So it was a very mixed mixed culture, I suppose, really. And it was in the country, you know, it was in the country, it wasn't in the town. But yeah, there would have been a certain wariness, maybe is a better word.
Well, I don't know what relation your Grandad Ned was to the uncle, was it? Armstrong Swindell.
That's that. The Morrows are my mum's side, and then Swindell's my dad.
Okay, so would they have known each other at that time, or would they not? Because one of them
probably not. Probably not. Not at that stage, no.
So at around about the same time, while one is being burnt out of their house in the south, the other is in the A or B or C specials.
Yeah.
Doing what they did in Northern Ireland.
Yeah, he was in the B. Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, and I suppose it's an indication of how troubled this place was at that time, because there were a lot of things happening on all sides.
That's right.
Were pretty traumatic. But that family history, is it potted history a wee bit of
it
what
is
was
a wee
going
bit,
on all around?
yeah. Yeah, I mentioned the war earlier, and I forgot to say my grandmother, the same Granny Morrow, her she was Taggart originally, and she's one that grown up in Glasgow in Scotland for most of her early years, and then they came back, married my granddad in 1914, and then her brother Josie sounds like a girl, but Josie is her brother. He went off to the war and he fought at the Somme. Well, he didn't fight as such. He was in the Royal Army Medical Corps, so he was a medic. And I remember, this is later on, I remember being told about when he died, his scissors were sent home from New Zealand to the family as a remembrance, you know. But he fought at the Somme, or was at the Somme and at Gallipoli. And they did talk about that, but they didn't have any other details other than that, you know, that he went away, and it was obviously so long ago, so I don't remember so much, but I always found it interesting that they sent home his scissors.
Do your family still have the scissors?
It didn't come to my mum, it came to a cousin, and she says she has them in the attic, but I've never seen them. I would love to see them.
I'm sure she does have. They're really important things in the family, aren't they?
Yeah. So it was quite interesting, you know. But I had no idea that there was that sort of. I didn't know that he was a medic, as in, you know, I just knew he went to the war and he was at the Somme and Gallipoli. I didn't understand till later that he was in the RAMC. And then when she told me about the scissors, I just thought that was hilarious. But he then, him and two sisters, after I think it was 1920. It was 1922. They went to New Zealand on the Ruahine. I know that's the name of the ship.
Okay.
And as far as I know, that was assisted. I think maybe one of the first assisted passages to New Zealand.
Right.
And the three families, the sister was married to a soldier, Robinson, another one was Anne and Susan. One was married to Patterson, and and the uncle. So that was the three in that family then just cleared off to. So again, that's just around partition. So whether that contributed to why they moved away, I'm not quite sure, but I think it probably did. You know, they wanted something different from life.
And what do you mean by that? Why would that have contributed?
Well, because of all the trouble happening, they were living at Carrickaheenan, which is not that far from the border. Mm-hmm. And I would say after the war, there wouldn't have been a lot of work. So, in my opinion, anyway, that probably has contributed to why they've thought, and the assisted passage, obviously, mm-hmm. that was why they'll head off.
More opportunities and away from this.
It has to be something
place.
Different, yeah. Mm-hmm. And they went and they never came back to live. They did come on holiday, I think, but mostly they came on holiday to a sister in Scotland, but they did come here as well, but not ever to stay.
Mm-hmm. And would you ever go out, or would there be any connections? Family to family?
We now have lost connection. I do have an address, but I presume it's nobody there, you know, because it's like 40-year-old address. Mm. And I know that Josie this is the one that was in the army or in the medical corps. I know he had sons, and there was an Andrew Taggart, and you know they had family over there. But who the next generation we've lost touch with, which is sad.
It is, and it often happens with families.
Yeah.
Isn't it? It's not exceptional. But it's really striking to me that in those years, you know, 19, 20, 21, 22, you're talking about a few events in your family history that are really substantial events, about mm-hmm. being burnt out of a house, about
that's right.
being on patrol and people dying on that patrol, and then other people leaving because there are better opportunities elsewhere. Yeah. That just want to get out of the place.
That's right.
And it shows how volatile Northern Ireland and Ireland was at mm-hmm. that time, and the effect it was having on families, I suppose.
Yeah, that's right. Mm. It obviously was a great time of fear. You know, it's hard to judge it from now because we've come out of the Troubles, and that was a different. You know, when I tried to explain to my nieces and nephews what that was like, they have no idea. I mentioned a control zone one day to someone, and they said, "What's that?" You know, and I thought, we grew up with that, and you thought nothing of it. So it's probably the same thing looking back. Mm. You know, we can't really comprehend because we weren't there, but there has to have been that sort of, you went somewhere and you didn't know if it was going to be a bomb or it was going to be whatever. You know, there was that constant awareness, I suppose, you know, that something could happen. Mm.
Yeah, and I'm wondering whether, you know, when we take our modern perspective and look back at this period, and the First World War, of course, was traumatic for loads of people too. But it seems a lot of people didn't talk about it afterwards.
No.
Talk about these things. They were just
That's
happened.
Right.
And
that's right.
And people didn't talk and moved on without addressing some of this stuff.
Yeah, I would say that's right. I think we're probably all guilty of it a bit. You know, when something bad happens, you just want to sort of cover it over and go away from it. You know, you don't want to. Every time you bring it up, it brings back emotions, and you want to go on. And it's not the right way to do things, but it's how we do it. We do it all the time. Mm-hmm.
But I suppose also, you know, these big events are happening, and life goes on, and people just live as they normally live, and there are all sorts of issues with neighbours and with family. Do you have any memories passed down about the sort of things that people did as neighbours and as members of the family?
Well, I know they always, the neighbours would have helped each other. And my grandmother, well, I know later on as well, when her husband died, but earlier it was a commonplace thing for, that's my phone, sorry. Okay. It was common just for neighbours to help on haymaking and all of that sort of thing. Can we stop for a second?
Yeah, sure. Go ahead. I'll just leave it on.
I'll just chase it. It's my nieces. I have 3 nieces, my sister and nieces that ring me every day.
And do they know all
Like a
about
group
this
chat.
history?
One of them would ask questions, the rest not so much. Oh, sorry. Glasses soon. That it?
That's it. I need glasses already, so it's. I don't have any sympathy. So yes, you were talking about neighbourliness and people getting on with their lives, despite all of these events happening.
Yeah,
around
despite
them.
all that, there was still, you know, if we went to help with the bale and they went to do the turf together, you know, one man might have had a cart or whatever to bring things home. Someone else had the donkey. It was basic, you know, everybody helped each other, and that seemed to actually carry on, even when all of this. Maybe they were trying, and maybe it was a kind of denial, or maybe it's because they know these people quite well. But there was a certain distrust at the same time. That seems to have, you know, it's been there. You were thinking, you know, what if something happens? Would they still look out for us or whatever, you know?
This is going back to the 1920s.
Yeah, going back there, but they
the
were
troubles at that time.
Yeah, but neighbours did help each other, you know, on the farm for my mum and dad. They would have talked about, you know, growing up, neighbours came, and my mother, when she's, you know, their farm, people helped out, no matter what it was they were needing to do. If they needed a man to help out, you know, somebody else's workman came and helped them, or the farmer themselves came and helped them, or vice versa. You know, they were always helping each other. You weren't paying somebody else as such, it was sort of taken in kind. So one helped in harvest, and not one, but I mean, somebody helped in the harvest time, they helped in the summertime, grass cutting, whatever was going on.
Mm-hmm. You would all...
And the spuds.
Oh, the spuds, and getting them out of the field.
Digging the spuds, yes, digging the pit for the spuds and all of that. Yeah.
People would say a lot of the time that especially around farms, communities would help each other. And things like the 12th of July and so on were still celebrated, but one side of the community may not have participated in it. Did anybody talk about what things like that were like at that time?
I think my mum would have said that at that time, I don't know when exactly, what time period she's talking about, but she would have talked about that both sides would have went to a 12th, that all had a holiday.
Okay.
So I don't know whether it was a drinking session or whether it was what the reason was, but there didn't seem to be animosity. But I suspect that around that late part of the 1919, 20, I would say that possibly would have changed. For those years anyway, at least.
Given everything that was going on?
Given everything was going on, they'd probably be more wary and, where they were seen, possibly. I don't know that, but I would imagine so.
So your family have been in the army, they've been in the police service, they're farmers, but they were also millers as well, amongst other things.
Yeah, my granda himself. Well, my father, this is putting it into context, I suppose my father would be, had he lived, he'd be 101 now. So my granda, when he had a young family, they were millers. He had leased a mill from, mostly he was a scotcher and a herd and, you know, like workman, just labourer, that sort of work. But for a time they leased a mill at Cushwash, which is just outside Lisnaskea on the far side of, towards Newton Butler direction of the town. And it was a flax mill. It later became a corn mill, but at that time it was a flax mill, and he would have worked as a scotcher and miller. So they were the people, you know, people went to get they brought the flax to, I presume. I know there's a mill pond, I've seen it, the mill race, or what was left of it. It's quite strange to look at now, you know, it's all overgrown and everything, so. But yeah, they were there. And in 1919 they were evicted from that because they leased it from a distant cousin who was a Swindell, a Frank Swindell, and he had been offered double the price. Instead of a tenner a year lease, he'd been offered by the co-op, which had set up in Lisnaskea. He was offered a £20. So they didn't want to go quietly, so he took them to court and they were evicted.
So they lost in court?
They lost in court. The courts decided with the owner.
Okay.
And they lost out, so they had to find new homes. And so he moved about 100 yards into a house, like a cottage. I found quite amusing that he still, lived almost beside it for a time. And
did he give up the milling and did you say scotching?
Yeah, the scotching would have been more part of the labour of the mill. That had been part of, I suppose, was what he'd done before. And he has just carried on while he was being miller.
You'll have to explain what the scotching is for anybody who doesn't know.
Well, I've only seen it at a National Trust property, but it's where they're sort of banging the raw flax to get the stuff out of it.
Right.
It looks quite. It's very manual labour. I don't know how to explain really, but
that's a good explanation.
It's very rough and hard on the hands. You'd be using it with just your bare hands, with no gloves or anything used then. And I just imagine a man with a big callousy hand. But he was a miller, and I find that interesting.
Yeah. And his livelihood.
But he kept, even after that, they continued to work in flax mills, but flax was starting to dwindle a bit at that time. But they still were working at that and working in corn mills. He done that sort of work afterwards. But they seemed to lose their business sense at that as well. So it obviously affected them economically,
Absolutely. I was going to say he was affected by the big co-op coming in and basically offering more money, and the owner said
double the money.
The owner said, dead on, thanks very much. And the law didn't stand by him. It just said, on your bike.
I don't understand why exactly, but whether it was just a money thing. I sort of think it probably was just money.
So that must have been very galling for them to put so much effort into it, and then suddenly they had to move on.
But it wasn't theirs, they leased it. They'd only had it for a matter of years, but even so, it obviously would have had an effect on their family. My grandfather had 9 kids eventually, so it would have been, better income than a scotcher would have been getting, because once you're a labourer again, you were going all over the place for work,
Tell us about your maternal grandmother then. That's Mary Morrow. So was she married to Ned?
She married Ned, yes.
And Ned was the bee special.
Yes, he was a carpenter, he was a farmer, and he I think he's described as a contractor on something that I've seen, but my mother always called him a carpenter. She talked about he did a big I don't know when he did this, but I know they were married in 1914, so I presume that he did it fairly that's my cat.
Beautiful.
Fairly soon after that, in their new home, he done a ceiling which is like an hexagonal shape, and it's all I think it wouldn't be pine, I don't know what wood, but it is like an hexagonal shape, and I have seen that since in like houses where they've had meetings, and apparently they did have, like, I presume Methodist type, meeting houses, but it wasn't a church as such, but they had this, like, their good room was used as a meeting room, but I don't know when that was time-wise now.
And that would have been your...
But he was obviously a good carpenter, and he did the pews for some of the local churches. I think it was the Lisnaskea Methodist Church.
But see, Ned was very lucky because his wife Mary, before she was married to him, she went off to Glasgow.
Yeah, the family, her father had taken them as children to Glasgow because he couldn't get work here.
Okay.
But that's before, that's sort of
It's 1900s or so?
around the
maybe?
1900s, just after maybe.
Okay.
I'm not sure, maybe 10 years or so away. They weren't an awful long time away, but they were, and I'm not even sure what he did in Glasgow.
But
I
it's
just know
really
they went to Glasgow to work, and I know we always called her our Scottish granny because she had this Scottish accent. You know, I do remember her. I was a little girl when she died, but I think it was 5 or 6. But I do remember she had this like a Scottish burr, very frail little woman, smaller than me, even a tiny wee woman, and but she was. Yeah, it was. I do whatever kind of work. There must have been, I don't know whether it was on docks or what it was, you know. I'd love to find out. I must look that into that at some stage, but I haven't done yet.
It's interesting that if I got this right, she left and went to Glasgow with her father, and
Yeah.
her father was working there, and they came back here in 1914.
They are back at some stage. I don't know when exactly they came back, but they did come back. They're back before she gets married, the family, and not just her. So whether work conditions changed or what happened, I don't know why they came back, but they did come back. Or maybe her parents, their parents, her grandparents, you know, maybe. For that reason. It's difficult to know now at this stage, but I don't remember being told that, why they came back.
But some of your family are, at this period, around 1913 to 22 roughly. So you've got some of your family who are abroad with work coming back to Ireland to live in Northern Ireland after 1921. And you've got some of your family emigrating to get work and better opportunities. And that's an interesting contrast between...
I'd forgotten that my granddad Swindell actually emigrated in 1910 to New York.
Wow.
But he came back. He can't have stayed very long. It was always told he made his fortune. We were never too rich, so I don't think he made too much. But they came back. He came back, but most of the rest of the family, after the mother died in 1908, and then most of his siblings drifted. One would go, and then another would go to the sister, and gradually nearly all went to America. And he seems to have been pretty much the only one came back again to live. So hence we're still here.
And is that just because this place is so beautiful and wonderful and the people are brilliant?
Obviously. I think he came back before his dad died. His father died in 1916, so that seems to make sense that he came back when his father died, and then he obviously fell in love with my granny. That's the Swindell side, so and we were doing the mill, so that's what they were working at that time. But he wasn't very long. My aunts have told me that he went to made his fortune. He came back rich with a Panama hat. And he wore this Panama hat, and he was called the Yankee around Lisnaskea. I'd forgotten all that. Yeah. So it was like a man that was obsessed by horses, loved horses, and he was actually good at carpentry as well, but he didn't work as a carpenter. So my two grandads, even though they may have known each other to sea, but similar sort of backgrounds.
I like the granda who comes back from America with the Panama hat.
With the Panama hat.
Walking around the town at a time when that wouldn't have been normal.
Swanking the place, you know. No, it probably wasn't normal. I'd forgotten that was that time period. But yeah, he came back and stayed, I presume, because he met my granny. But yeah, there was a lot of emigration, a lot of... as I say, my grandmother on my mum's side, that was 3 of her siblings went to New Zealand. So there was obviously quite a lot of that going on as well, but people went away for work and for all sorts of reasons.
And this granny of yours, who was over in Glasgow, came back, married your granda Ned. It was her brother, Josie, who
was the medic
at
the Somme, yeah, in Gallipoli, yeah.
And he came back? No. Did he? What happened to him?
Josie.
Yes.
He came back for a while, but then they emigrated to New Zealand in
Yes.
1922. So he only stayed a few years after the war.
Yes. And did he come back from New Zealand ever to say hello to people, or it's a long way? At
I
that
believe
time?
they came. I think they did come to Scotland because they had a sister, Sarah, in Scotland. She met and married somebody in Scotland, and she stayed there. And I know he came back and stayed with them, but I'm not fully certain. I think he did visit here, but I'm not fully certain if he visited my granny. But they did write a lot. They seemed to write like reams. So they talked about long, newsy letters, you know.
And would your family have kept those letters? I don't want to see them, but I'm just curious to know.
I don't have those particular ones. I do have one of my, of his sister, another sister, when she was in, the one that married this Johnson Burney that was at Rosslea with my granda. She was in Glasgow when she was there. She was going out with, I think was the term, another soldier, not him.
Oh, she was courting somebody else.
And I have it's like a postcard thing that is all drawn, like wee drawings on it, and it's like very little. He has a wee poem on it, and there's not very much writing, but he's going to call on her.
He wrote her a poem.
He wrote her a little poem. It's like I think it was just like 4 lines. I can't remember now. It's in my bag upstairs. But he wrote her this poem, and he was going to call, if it was okay to call on her, and he'd had the pleasure of meeting her whatever day, and some sort of rubbish like that.
You see, you're saying that's rubbish. That's very romantic, is it?
Well, it was very romantic, but she didn't marry him.
It's better than getting a text from him or something.
Yeah, no text those days, but yeah, it's quite emotional to look at it, because it's, you know, he obviously put a lot of thought, and then it's on it where he was, I'm not sure if it's where he's stationed or whether it's his platoon, maybe. There's some sort of wee drawing of the army thing, right, so that we knew he was a soldier.
Right.
But it was quite amusing. It's quite old-fashioned written. You know, the language used is very old-fashioned and courtly, let's say. I'd forgotten about that as well.
Now, you also have the great uncle James.
Oh yes.
Who is he?
He is another brother of Ned, and he died. He said they're only just 19 or 20 when he dies. He died. They were still living at Carrickaheenan, which is again way up, as we call the mountain country. He took Spanish flu, and he died very quickly. I think it was. He wasn't ill very long, you know. And he was healthy. It wasn't a sickly young man or anything. It took such a severe effect, you know, that he died.
So this would have been 1919 or 1920 with Spanish flu, would it?
Yeah, 1919.
Right. That's dreadful. And he was young, healthy at that point.
He was a young, healthy man, yeah.
Do you know how the family reacted to that, or thought about that?
I don't, other than to know that I didn't know it was Spanish flu as such. When I was told, I just was told he died young, took very sick and died young very quickly. I didn't know what it was until I researched it, right, and found that that's what it was. But no, they didn't really talk about it. They did talk about him dying young, and that left, because my grandfather, I think there was 7 of them. There was 3 girls. 2 of them died in their 40s. My granda died in his 40s off the motorbike, and a Charles went to Canada, and then this young one died. So it was like a whole tragic family, you know. They didn't seem to have much luck, if you believe in luck, you know. They're just one of those families that seem to get hit a lot, with that sort of tragedy. And he probably was the one that they thought was going to farm at home, but he obviously didn't.
This is James.
Yeah.
He died of Spanish flu. I suppose
it's very sad, you know.
Well, you think of that. I mean, I think of that in terms of today's pandemic and COVID-19 and so on. And 100 years ago, this sort of thing was happening, but they didn't have the same health service and
I don't think they may not even have had antibiotics at that time. I'm not sure. I can't remember when that started, but it sounds frightening.
Families just had to get on with it and support each other.
And no welfare, anything like that at that time. I hope he had a doctor, but you know, a lot of the times, as I mentioned, they went for old remedies and things. A doctor wasn't sent for until you were almost about to kick the bucket because it cost a lot of money.
Which meant that if you didn't have money, then you didn't get the care and support that you needed, maybe.
That's right. Well, the Morrows seemed to be better off. My daddy's family, the Swindells, weren't as thrifty, really.
They enjoyed their life more.
Yeah, well, they had bigger families too, which didn't help, but they didn't own, you know, they rented. Whereas Grandis Morrow's family, they had farms of land, so they would have been able to live off, they would have been more self-sufficient, I suppose, because they would have grown their own veg and all that sort of stuff, you know.
What do you think that they would have made of it if they were able to look forward at you now and the area now? What do you think they'd make of it?
My Granny Morrow would probably be very positive, and thinking, you know, we've come through that and it'll be all right, you know, it'll all pass. Should have been more that, it'll be more her character. My grandfather's side, I remember, as always laughing. I think I got a wee bit of that. So I think they were probably more positive. Yeah, I think you were, what you said, they just got on with it. You know, you got on with what you had to do, you did it, and that was it. Yeah, I think that's probably what they would have done. And I mean, what else can you do? You just have to make the best of each day and hope that you don't get sick or get this pandemic. Like, it's a frightening thing, and it's a frightening time we're living in, but even at that, you know, you still try and you do your daily things that you need to do and be as careful as you can, and that's all you can do.
Well, your granddad Ned, so this is, how long do you know was he in the B Specials, and was he in the RIC before, or did he join just in 1921?
I never heard of him being in the RIC, so I don't think he was. I presume he has just joined, you know, because of the trouble in the area, and he wanted to do his part. Yeah,
because it was very...
He had been a emotive kind of subject at the time, you know. It had been just very... that it felt they wanted to protect their land, maybe even, you know. There was no talk of any... My family didn't talk much in politics, you know. That's even thinking back, I can't remember very much talked about politics. I mean, you knew they were a unionist and they had that unionist background, but I don't think they were extreme in any shape or form. You know, they wanted to live their lives, and that was it. So if I had to guess, I would say he probably wasn't in the place, because he was a farmer, he was a carpenter, he did contracts on the country, so I don't see how he would have had time.
Sure, and the V Specials were a part-time thing?
They were a part-time thing, that's right.
You were called out when needed?
I think it was night patrols mostly.
Okay.
Yeah.
And was he a young man at that time, or what sort of age would he have been around 1921?
Was he 42 or 3 when he died in 32, so what's that? So he's early 30s, late 20s, early 30s.
When did he die and what age?
He died in 1932, and I think he's either 43 or 44 when he died.
Oh my goodness, that's very young, isn't it?
Uh-huh.
Oh my goodness. And was he ill when he died, or was it?
Oh no, motorbike
Oh, he was
accident
a
just
motorbike,
up
sorry.
at Liston Ski, yeah.
Right. Okay. Yeah. Gosh, that must have been.
Yeah, he was killed outright. So yeah, that must have been
Dreadful for the
just,
family.
yeah,
Yeah, good.
terrifying.
Is there anything else, Linda, you want to talk about around that period? We've gone through an awful lot there.
Yeah,
that's
there is a lot.
fantastic.
No, I don't think there's anything. I can't think of anything else. I can't think of anything else.
That's okay.
That's not bad.
That's great.
I'm surprised that I got as much. I remembered as much. It's you know, it's those kind of things you when you know about, you know, those little bits, and then when you're getting to sort of my age, you're wanting to think, I'd love to ask my parents, you know, this, and this, but of course they're not here to ask.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right, and you know, it's only when people are gone that you realise I should have made more use of that time. Because when people are here, you think, I'll talk about it some other time, and then you never get around to it.
No.
And they're very reluctant sometimes to talk about because they don't think you're interested, but actually, I know I am, and we obviously are.
Probably my dad. I remember at one stage at school, excuse me, we were asked to do like a family tree, but it was just a very basic family tree, and I tried writing it out, and I asked my dad all this, and he'd give me his uncles and aunts' names, but he couldn't remember very much, and he sort of vaguely recalled a surname from, you know, a previous generation. And then when I asked more, he said, oh, go away and leave me alone. He just didn't want to be bothered, you know. But it wasn't that, I don't think it was that they wanted to keep it from you, they just couldn't see the relevance, you know.
I think you're right, and it's just sad and unfortunate because these stories shouldn't be lost. And I'm thinking particularly, and we sort of skipped over it a wee bit, of Uncle William, who, with that telegram.
Oh yeah.
And I mean, I had an uncle that served in World War One and died as well, and the family almost skips over that history of what happened to him. It wasn't as well. He died, so it was as traumatic as what happened to your Uncle William, but there wasn't a telegram that said missing in action. It's hard to...
My mum would have... the bit that I remember most is about her saying about the granny, that she never accepted it. You know, she didn't talk much about the man himself. You know, whether she didn't remember him, well, I suppose she wouldn't have remembered him, but whether they didn't tell her much about him or whether he was just old enough to go to war and went, I don't know, but there wasn't, the emphasis was always on the woman, you know, that poor granny never got over it, you know.
Because that's who she knew.
But then mummy was reared mostly, because she was only 7 when her daddy died or was killed, so I suppose she was raised mostly by women, and it was a women household, you know, the two old grannies living there as well. So maybe that's why it was such a tragedy for old granny.
Yes, and that's the old granny amongst the two grannies that was living in the house. Yeah.
There was another old lady with them as well, they called Aunt Beck, and I have still not been able to work out who Aunt Beck is. But she may not have been related at all, you know, as you say, sometimes they just took in a neighbour. But I can find no Aunt Beck. But I've always found that curious, and that was that time as well, but I've decided they're not related, Aunt Beck, you know. That was a courtesy aunt.
Sounds like a Rebecca, doesn't it?
But I found no Rebecca, so I don't know why I'm talking about that. But anyway, that it was just really, it was this sort of, I suppose it was a woman household she grew up in, so maybe that's why I do remember, or that she remembered mostly, it was how the granny felt. I suppose she knew the granny too, and was different maybe.
Yeah, no, I think that's right, and of course, it is the women and the children who are left to cope and pick up the pieces.
Yeah.
So that's why it's right that there's attention on them. But I'm wondering if the young man, you know, he might have been 18, he might have been 20, 22, 23, who knows? And his life is taken, and the family get a medal and telegram, and that's
Yeah,
it.
I presume they got a medal. Never heard that mentioned either. You know, that's what I mean. There was very few details passed on about himself, but it was how that affected the granny, and that's what she remembered.
This is somebody taken from
Uh-huh.
her and the family.
Maybe it affected her mood, you know, for the rest of her life. I don't know whether it wasn't just, you know, whether she just couldn't cope. But that was never said either. You know, it was never.
And what was his? He was
don't-
Uncle William, but what was his surname?
I'm presuming Morrow.
He was a Morrow as well.
I'm presuming he's Morrow because I know it was old Granny Morrow that lived with them.
Right.
It was two Granny Morrows, so I'm presuming he's Morrow. But then again, he could be. I suppose there's a chance that he could be something else, but I did try to do research, but I can't find him, which annoys me.
Well, I know the Psalm Centre. I don't know if you've been there.
I
but
have
they-
been
yeah,
some
they
years
couldn't-
back.
They couldn't help you.
I haven't. It's quite a long time ago since I've been, but yeah, it might be worth trying again.
And you don't know where his battle was or what year it
No,
was?
I don't even know. You know, I've always had this in my head that it was France, but I can't. The more I think about it, I can't remember being told that it was France. So whether I've just thought, you know, France, the war was France, but where, which I know it wasn't necessarily.
Yeah, no,
But-
well, absolutely. Was he an Ulster volunteer?
I have no idea. You see, I have no idea which regiment or anything. I would have assumed the Enniskillings, maybe.
Yeah, of course. Of course, the museum down in Enniskillen might be able to know where they were as a regiment.
Or the Royal Irish Rifles or something like that, but I really don't know.
Yeah,
And without any of that information, it's very difficult.
yeah. No, you're absolutely right.
But yeah, it's one I would like to solve someday.
I'm sure you will. Is there anything else, Linda, you
No,
want?
that's it.
You know what? We've been talking for about an hour, and that's
Have we?
Yes.
Oh my
I think
goodness.
So, and that's absolutely brilliant. Yeah, just short of an hour. So I'm going to stop it now.
Yeah,
But
that's
listen, can I
fine.
say thank you very much for that?